Formal recording. Okay, so recording started. So away we go. And as I like to start all of my recorded sessions with, just to remind you not to say anything that you don't want the rest of the world to see. And if you're concerned about people seeing you, then by all means, this is the time to hit the stop video button. And away we go. Okay, now you should be seeing our PowerPoint for today. And as you probably heard me say many times, I don't think of these exactly in the way that I normally think of PowerPoints. If I was originating the PowerPoints, I would work on about 10 per hour. And that way there's a lot more talking than things flashing across in front of you. And yet we have to get through about 60 or 70 of them in a typical 2-hour session. And the reason for that is that the PowerPoints here are really a study guide. And so there's a lot of stuff on here that if I read to you, it's about as boring as listening to me reading the phone book. And it's probably better for you to read in your own time. I'll be going through basically the highlights as I do each week. Now, this one is one, as I say, it's getting to the part of the unit which I think is where this stuff gets really interesting. You need to have the mathematical skills, and you're probably sick of hearing me rabbiting on about the importance of precision in getting the right answer. You know, at school, the mathematics teachers will be giving you a lot of marks for showing the working. But just think about what it would be like if you asked somebody to do a financial plan for you or an analysis of some project, maybe costing or worth tens of millions or maybe even hundreds of millions of dollars. And at the end of it, you gave them an answer and it was wrong. Sent the bloke bankrupt or maybe ruined the company or whatever. Okay, just imagine that. This is like real money. And right now, doing a little bit of consulting, it involves doing a bit of asset valuation, and the number that we're working to is around $100 million. And I'm doing that for a friend and colleague. If I get the wrong answer in that, conceivably it could cost a company an awful lot of money. Now, they're not going to come along and say, Dr. Small, thank you very much for doing that very clever Excel spreadsheet. We will give you 90% for your working. Pity you got it wrong. You know, we are going bankrupt, but, you know, we really appreciate your working. You know, can you imagine that? In the big bad world of industry, they'll be taking you to court and probably putting you into prison and all sorts of dreadful things. And so when I do that kind of work, and this is real life work, I know that I only get paid for getting the right answer. And so when I do that sort of project, and when you do this sort of project, because this is the sort of stuff that you guys will be able to do when you're, you know, in the real world, what you'll have to do is apply the professional discipline to work out ways to make sure that every calculation that goes off your desk has been thoroughly checked in such a way that you're really, really confident that it's right. Okay. As I say, I keep coming back to that, and I guess it's because I've spent a lot of time in the industry. I know how it works. I know the excitement of it, the satisfaction of being able to value something worth $100 million and get the right answer and be able to do it better than anyone else. That's wonderful. And that's what I'd like you guys to be able to do, whether it's a financial investment you're evaluating or giving someone a financial advice in some way, or valuing a property for somebody who wants to buy themselves, you know, an office tower or, you know, a Westfield shopping centre somewhere. It's an exciting world, but you really do have to apply that discipline. There's no point in going into finance saying, oh yeah, you know, I'm not very good at maths, you know. It's almost like maths is the foundation upon which you build your financial skill. Okay, and that's what I want for you guys. Why am I talking about that now? Especially since this week we're not going to be talking about maths very much at all. I'm going to do a little tiny bit of maths at the beginning of this class, but really what I do is talk to you a little bit about the assignment we've just done, and so on. Unfortunately, the marking for the assignment has really slowed me down fiercely. Couple of reasons for that, but one of the main ones is that I asked everyone to hand it in through the SurveyMonkey data entry system, and only about 2/3 of people who did the assignment bothered to do that. Some people may have had some unavoidable technical problems. Yep. Some people may not have actually read the right part of the assignment that sort of said, do that. All the places on Moodle site where it said repeatedly, put it in SurveyMonkey.
Can I make a suggestion when it comes to SurveyMonkey?
Yeah.
You know how you had the link because it was right down the bottom because I missed it the first time.
Sure.
If you ever in the future do have it submit through SurveyMonkey, maybe put the link where we have to submit as well. So you know how you can do the information for the assignment, maybe perhaps put the link in there because that's where I think I got the assignment download from. So
Okay.
I don't think I looked down the bottom.
I'll take that on board. No, 100%. Yep. Okay. No, I take that. Okay. Yeah. Marking them one at a time for a whole lot of obscure software reasons ended up being frightfully time consuming, and I'm still actually, still got about half a dozen of them to finish up. I was hoping they had been done before this workshop, and hopefully, well, definitely before I have dinner tonight, I'll have them all done. Yeah, no, that's a good point and a good suggestion. Unfortunately, with this coronavirus stuff, we're kind of working this stuff on our end out as we're going along a little bit. And yeah, no, that's an excellent suggestion. I appreciate it. And I think as time goes on, this thing will become far more sort of straightforward. What I will be doing, and what I mentioned to the workshop class yesterday, is that for anyone who finds themselves coming in under the line, the magic pass line, 15 out of 30, I'll be giving an opportunity for people to resubmit if they want, with a view to a satisfactory submission as bringing them up to a pass mark. So that'll be to 15. Okay, and that way I go away with the comfortable knowledge that all of you guys are at least able to get your head around these calculations. And so I'm not sort of sending anyone out without those skills, but also to recognise the people who did the hard work first time round, and a lot of people did surprising, or not surprisingly well, just wonderfully well. I'm kind of impressed. So there were a lot of in the high 20s in the assignment, but there are also an unfortunate number of people that were, probably 15, 16 or below. And I think that's unfortunate. Now I know, from another life, I used to teach mathematics at school once. I only did it for about a year. It was my transition into university, and I must say it'd been a long time since I'd been at school myself. Found myself teaching maths. I came from an engineering background, and I was absolutely appalled at the way maths is taught at school. I hope none of you guys are teachers sort of in another life, but I have great doubts about the method of teaching mathematics at school these days. Now, that's something that you guys are probably mainly victims of, and I can understand that a lot of people, unless you're really smart, have find maths almost impregnable through school. Some people get it and they do really, really well. Other people find that, maths isn't my strong suit, or they'll say lots and lots of things like that. That is not your fault, by the way. An awful lot of very intelligent people just don't understand mathematics these days, largely because of the odd way that mathematics is being taught. And as I say, my experience in teaching high school was back in the late 80s, so it's a long time ago, probably further back than some of you guys have been on the planet for. When I looked at it closely, I discovered that the rot had set in probably about 20 years earlier. In the 70s, the Australian school system decided to change the way they taught mathematics. And it I think, has been an unfortunate result. Now, unfortunately, we're going from school where mathematics is taught remarkably badly. And as I say, if you don't like maths, I understand entirely. I've taught maths at school. I've tutored people doing HSC, all sorts of stuff, and I understand the problems. But industry, it doesn't accept that as an outcome. It's one of the reasons why we don't have as many engineers as we used to in Australia. But also it's one of the reasons why this stuff is really, really important when you get into the mathematical side of the business world. Now, you can do HR and management and a lot of other, shall we say, soft science of management, kind of pop psychology side. But when you get into the business side, to be an accountant, these days you can rely a lot on the software to help you. But accountancy, finance, investment advice, you really have to be sharp with your maths. And, you know, in a sense, it's a bit like, you know, discovering that, you know, you've been sort of taught that the Earth's flat or something, and then suddenly have to adjust to the reality that there's something else going on out there. The same thing is kind of happening with the maths. And I say, this is definitely not a criticism of anyone in the class. I understand it entirely. When I was teaching face-to-face, I remember being appalled at the number of really smart students who would sort of come into my office and just tell me that they hated maths or they didn't understand it or what have you. And it just seemed to be just such a damn crying shame. Anyway, what do we do? Do remedial maths at university? Yep, we can do a bit of that. We really got to change the whole approach to it. Now, for you guys, what it means is that as you move into your, you know, careers, you just have to take that on the chin. You know, okay, you've been dealt a very unfortunate bit of abuse, really, in the way that mathematics has been taught. But in the real world, we still have to be able to get, you know, 3 2s a 6. And so there's kind of no way around that. So to a certain extent, work out how to get over that yourself. You know yourselves how comfortable you are with the maths. One thing you know, these days with Corona, a lot of people have found themselves homeschooling unexpectedly. I homeschooled most of my kids for most of their education voluntarily. I was in education myself. It's one of the reasons why I didn't let them go to school. Most of the time, my kids didn't want to go to school. And it meant that we were able to teach maths in a completely different way. And my kids don't go around saying, hey, I'm a maths guru. But I do know that they can all do maths very comfortably, and they're not necessarily very clever kids. Probably not as intelligent as a number of you guys. Just that the methods we used worked well, largely because they're the methods that were used in the West to educate kids in mathematics basically for hundreds of years, but also stopped and changed in the 1970s. Anyway, that's a topic for another day. So you guys, one way or another, just have to get back to, you know, working out your way around it. Okay, with the assignment, as I say, it's almost typical. When you teach mathematics, certainly in like business maths and stuff like that, one of the things that is not uncommon is to find what we call a twin peak in the distribution of grades. You know how in statistics you're supposed to have like a bell curve, you know, like a big peak in your results for whatever. In a lot of mathematics subjects, you find twin peaks, like a double normal distribution. And the reason is that you've got two groups in the class. One group who get it and tend to get almost everything right, and the other group that don't and battle to get a pass mark. And so you end up with like this double bump in your class. And it's legendary, right? And again, it's not anything to do with any particular student. The trick is, I mean, it makes it really, really hard setting mathematical exam papers, because if you make it easy enough for the low peak to pass, then the high peak are bored. If you make it challenging for the high peak people to really sort out who really should get a credit distinction or high distinction, you find that, a big part of your class fail, and you don't want that. So setting mathematic papers is a bit of a challenge. With the assignment, all of the assignment questions were basically set, I won't say verbatim, not word for word, out of what we did in the first 4 weeks, but virtually. All of the maths is basically stuff that came from the questions that we used, and in many cases went over and demonstrated in class in those first 4 weeks. And so if you find that you didn't get the right answer, maybe, there are a handful of people that didn't put their student number in. That made it really hard to pass. Most folks weren't sure which equations to use, and there were a handful of places where people one way or another appeared to have simply got the data in wrong. Getting the data in wrong is something that we all do. It's easy to write the number 32, or like read the number 32, and then write the number 23. It's called transposition. Usually it's more like, a number like, 1,327,000, blah, 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 and you write 1,230, blah, 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 right? But transposition errors are very common, and they're probably one of the most common ones. But in this assignment, the common problem was not knowing which equation to work on. Now, that's a curious issue, and I think it goes somewhere into the problem with the way that maths is taught. And I've said all these bad things about the way schools have been running for a long time, and one of the evidences of that, one of the ways that you can sort of see at least one aspect of it, is what I call the template approach to problem solving, certainly to mathematics. And the template approach works like this. I don't really understand mathematics, but I'm a smart person. I've got a good brain. And I go to study something, whether it's year 12 at school, university, whatever it is, doesn't matter. Some course that my work puts me through. And on that course, the clever people that are teaching it give me the solutions for so many problems, maybe 20 problems. And I simply memorize the solutions to those 20 problems. And I come out of the course and I pass, and the boss gives me a raise and all that sort of stuff, and I go away happy. I still don't really have a clue at all as to what's going on in those 20 formulas or 20 templates that I use to solve those problems. All I know is that I've got something like a compounding problem. I pull out the template for compound interest. I don't know what it is, don't know how it works. All I know is that there's this bunch of mathematical squiggles, and if I follow that through, put it into my clever calculator, I'll get the right answer. That's a template approach. It's a very popular approach with getting through the HSC. And you may have remembered that from when you did high school yourselves. How do you prepare for the HSC? You do a whole lot of past papers, and you go into the exam with this, head full of templates to solve the kind of problems that were in the old HSC papers, and away you go. That will actually help you to pass the test, knowing those templates. But it doesn't help you very well when it comes to solving problems related to the things which are involved in that particular topic that you learned the templates for. You see what I'm kind of getting to? And so, I see it a bit today. It's one of the several reasons why I go out of my way not to show people what buttons to press on their calculators. Okay? One of them is that when you're using financial calculators, there's, at least half a dozen mainstream brands of calculators, and even some of them have got a couple of different calculators that work in completely different ways. And so if I was to start teaching people how to press buttons, then I'd have to basically teach the same stuff half a dozen times. And then some student would come along and say, oh, you know, I didn't pass that assignment because I had an XYZ calculator and you taught me how to solve the problem on an ABC calculator, and therefore it's your fault that I've failed. So that's one reason. The deeper reason why I don't like teaching people how to press buttons on their calculators to solve problems at university is that I want you guys to understand the mathematical theories and relationships that are involved, so that from there on, working out how to press those buttons becomes something which is really obvious to you. And if you end up with a slightly different problem in industry, you'll be able to know to press some different buttons because you simply haven't been given the calculator button pressing template for, you know, the 30 calculations that you cover in business finance, right? Does that sort of make sense to folks? It's a bit of a subtle idea, but I really do recommend to you. You can't do it quickly. It does mean that, you know, until this stuff twigs for you, it will take time. And it's a matter of just looking at stuff, writing, scribbling on pieces of paper, working with your calculator, working with Excel, doing whatever. But that time, like learning to ride a bicycle. You know, some people get really proud, you know, and they can't ride a bicycle. You know, they're little kids. And they say, oh, I'm not really interested in riding a bicycle. Oh, no, that's really stupid, you know, right? And the reason is that it's actually pride, right? They can't ride a bike. They haven't sort of spent the time learning how to do it. But then they just go and poo-poo anyone who can ride the bike because, you know, they can do something that muggins can't, right? Whereas for the kids that are willing to, you know, put the time in, fall over, hopefully on the grass and not on the gravel, and do that a few times, and eventually they get it. And then after they get it, they don't even think about it anymore. You know, you guys sort of ride your bicycle sort of around the block. You don't think about which pedal's going up and which one's going down and whether it's sort of balancing or which way to turn the handlebars, all that sort of stuff. You don't think about that because you've done it so often it's second nature. The maths has the capacity to become like that second nature. And that takes, a bit like riding a bike, it just takes time, application, the willingness to make a fool of yourself and maybe get the wrong answer here and there, but also the willingness to pick yourself back up, put yourself back on your bike or back in front of your calculator or in front of your piece of paper, and work out why you're wrong. The neat thing about maths is that it's not like magic, you know. Why doesn't saying some words in Harry Potter get the job done? Who knows? It's magic like that, right? Maths is fantastic because there's a reason for everything. If you get the wrong answer in, say, one of the questions in the assignment, take it as an opportunity and invitation to go back to that chapter in the or that module in the course, and therefore that chapter in the textbook, and find out why it is you had the wrong idea. That's an invitation, and it's an opportunity for growth and development. And when you come out of it at the end, you'll feel really, really good. Not only that, you'll feel really confident because then you'll have something that you'll carry for the rest of your lives. And so it's kind of like the opportunity there. And it's one of the lovely things about science as opposed to magic. I think that a lot of people come away from high school education thinking that maths is more like magic. It's this mysterious set of incantations that you do, templates I call them when I'm being friendly. Don't know any idea about why they work. It's just that if you do them precisely, you'll get through the HSC. You still don't know mathematics, even though you've got a nice pass in the HSC. Okay, with the assignment, I'm going to finish grading them. Most of you should have the results by now, and most of you should have either something which looks like your assignment file with the marks showing you which ones are right, which ones are wrong, or majority of you will have a small spreadsheet that comes out with you put your spreadsheet, your student number in one end, and once you put your student number in, your name comes up and also which questions you got right and wrong. And from that, I'll invite you to sort of go back. You know that the questions are numbered in terms of which week in the course they were. So question 1 is week 1, question 2 comes from week 2, question 3 comes from week 3, 4, 5, so on. And so with that, you should be able to go back and work out where you went wrong with each one of those questions. And that's really an opportunity for you. And hopefully, if you attack it in the same way that Poirot or Sherlock Holmes attacks some, detective story, there's a light in there waiting for you as you discover the right way to do it. And once you've worked out the right way to do it, as I say, you end up with a skill that you'll be able to use in your professional career or your personal financial lives forever. Okay, so that's the assignment. After I get it all done, as I say, I'll be publishing an invitation for people who came in without a pass to be able to redo their assignment, resubmit it, and I'll be showing you how to do that with a view to giving everyone the opportunity to come up to 15 out of 30. And for those people who did better than that, congratulations, and especially those people that got on the high side of 25, and a surprisingly lovely number of those people, really impressed for all the reasons I've just been talking about, because it means that you really are on the ball and you've worked out some stuff. Some of those questions were not on the easy end. There are a couple of them that were meant to separate the distinctions from the high distinctions. So the fact that you didn't get them all, don't feel bad about that. In the unit, we are covering a range of things from simple mathematics, financial maths that everyone should know, to those more involved things. And I must say, for instance, that whole puzzle of working out share price, where you've got supernormal profits in the first few years, mate, you get that one right, and it means that you really, really understand the financial maths and the strategies of what's involved and all the rest of it, and congratulations to you. So I make no apologies for some of those questions being difficult, because they are a reward for those people who are really putting in the extra yards and have done a great job. So well done with that. And those guys who have done that, you'll know who I'm talking about. And so I just want to congratulate you. Okay, now I want to move into what we're doing this week. Okay, now this week, as I say, hardly any maths in it, so that's kind of good news. However, I'm going to do a little demonstration before we really get into the PowerPoints, which is going to involve mathematics. And the reason is that I want you to be able to see this situation from a particular perspective, which will make the rest of the topic really straightforward, I think. And a lot of the ideas that are in this topic kind of actually cover the issues involved, but they do it in a way which, if you don't understand the fundamentals, still be a little bit puzzling, right? It's a topic which, at the very least, read through the PowerPoint slides, because remember I say they are a study guide, they're a set of study notes, and really, if you understand the PowerPoints really, really well, you'll pass the course. No? However, if you really want to be confident with passing the course and to get the most out of it, and really the most enjoyment out of it as well, on this topic especially, maybe not especially, because I like you to read the textbook for all of them, but for this one, reading the textbook is a delight. It introduces you to what I think of as almost like the human side of the corporation. You know, the interpersonal tussles and tensions that affect the way that businesses run. And I think that's fabulously interesting. You might think I love the mathematics, but I kind of love the social side of it more, the psychology almost of it. And so that's waiting for you. It's laid out really nicely in the textbook, and so I can't plug the textbook enough. This topic especially, it doesn't read like some of the earlier textbooks that are, all sort of facts and skills and tricky stuff. This reads, I think, maybe not like a detective story, but certainly like a good novel. There's a flow to the ideas that are being presented, which I think is very attractive, and especially since most of us are moving eventually into some part of the corporate world, it introduces you to the culture, if you like, of the corporate perspective, certainly the management perspective. So that's kind of all in front of you. Definitely read the textbook. If you don't have the textbook by now, this chapter and maybe a bit of stuff that's sort of following it really makes it, I think it really makes it worthwhile. And it's kind of hard to completely get the feel without it. Or maybe you'll be able to pick it up in other places, but certainly, yeah, if there was one chapter of the textbook that I'd recommend that people read, it'd probably be this one. Okay, now, let's get into that. I said that I wanted to do a bit of a demonstration that had a bit to do with mathematics before we got started, and that's what I'm going to be doing. Now, right back at the beginning of the term, I gave you an exercise, a self-correcting exercise. It was meant to give you a bit of an idea of some Excel skills which are useful, called FinTute, F-I-N-T-U-T-E. This week, I'm going to be doing a little bit more of an investigation from the first task in FinTute. So you don't have to go back to that necessarily. I've also got it in Moodle under this week, week 10. So you can pull down this version of it. And so it's only meant to look at leverage. The thing that I want to get you to look at and think about is the magic of debt leverage. We've already talked about debt. You know how to value debentures. You've got an idea of the different forms of creditors and all that sort of stuff. We've done that in earlier weeks, right? That's the phone book stuff, okay? Here, we're going right to the heart of why using debt is important, useful, attractive, and also some of the downsides, the challenges, the hidden traps in using debt. And so because we're talking about that, I want to illustrate it mathematically to begin with. This is task one from the FinTute exercise, so you can go back to FinTute and actually build this yourself. If I had more time, I would actually fill in this part of the model before we got underway, just to impress upon you the importance of building these things yourself. Don't just take some bit of cleverness that Small's given you. You know, it's not going to help you in 10 years' time when you're out in industry. It's good for you to be able to sort of knock this sort of stuff up yourself, right? And there's no reason why you can't. Okay, what have I done? I've simply put a handful of equations together to work out my return on equity, my yield, the rate of profit, whatever you want to call it, okay? And in this particular situation, with these particular parameters, I've got a return on equity of 4.73%, okay? It's worked from a property investment example. It could be evaluating shares or a business or some sub-project that a business is thinking of adding into its portfolio of activities. It could be a new line of drug that some pharmaceutical company is thinking of producing. Doesn't really matter. It's going to be something which has got a cost. In this case, we're calling it property value. I could call it asset value. Its promises to produce some ongoing income, some revenue, what we might call an operating earnings, the cash flow from operations. EBIT is a common expression that we use, or EBITDA. I'll leave out the DA for the moment. Earnings before interest and taxes. And earnings before interest, this is an earnings amount. And you'll notice here I've got interest, because I'm talking about the parameters of debt, and I've got taxes, okay? And the example is very simple. I've got a property that's worth $120,000. I've got net rent, which is $10,000. This could be $120,000 worth of shares, or $120,000 worth of machine. And this could be the dividend, it could be the net earnings from using that machine, whatever it is. I'm just using it as a property example. Okay. I've taken the net rent over here. I've just simply borrowed that 10,000. I've worked out the interest. I work out the interest by simply multiplying the asset value by the leverage, gives me the principal of the loan, and multiply that by the 6% because it's an interest-only loan. That gives me $4,320. That gives me pre-tax profit. Then I'll work out taxation on the basis of, that's a pretty crazy tax rate. I'll put that back down to 30%. Tax rate, $1,704 is 30% of 5,680, leaves me with a net profit of $3,976. And because that 3,976 is a proportion of 48,000, I can work out my yield. Simply we divide one by the other, and the yield I've got is 8.28%. That's very simple calculation of my net yield, my net return on equity. Why am I starting our class with this? Could have done this a few weeks ago when we were looking at that sort of stuff. But now I want to actually look at what happens when things change. Why am I bothering to use debt? And I'll answer that question by simply illustrating what happens when I change these numbers. The blue numbers, when I do models, I always put my data, my input numbers in blue, and the calculations in other colors, usually black. I'm going to take the debt out of here. I'm simply going to make no debt at all. Okay. The model is simply telling me that if I've got the same business, earning the $10,000, asset value of 120, with no debt at all, return on equity after tax is 5.83%. So what has debt done? I've borrowed money rather than spent my own. And what has it done to my yield on the money that I have spent? We watch this by when I hit the return on right now on the 60%. Watch what happens down here in this square. Okay, 5 point something turns into 8 point something. I've added something like about 50% to my earnings. Okay? That's the advantage of using debt. Without changing anything about the project, about the asset performance, about the business, I've increased my rate of income quite significantly. I'll do it again, 8.28, put in 0, it goes down to 5.8. Okay, so what's that? That's roughly 2.5% more. It's about 50% more. Who doesn't want their rate of profit to increase by 50% without actually changing anything? It doesn't mean you have to make any more, you don't have to work any harder, brewing beer, baking bread, whatever you're doing in your business. Doesn't mean you have to collect any more rent from your tenant, but suddenly your rate of profit has increased by 50%. That's fantastic. And that's the attraction of using debt. When a company looks at the same problem, that might be BHP doing mining, or National Australia Bank, or probably a bank's not a good example. Financial companies are a bit peculiar. But Tip Top Bakeries, the Courier Mail, sort of printing newspapers, you know, any other business, right? They get the choice of either funding all their assets using equity or funding using debt. Their business is their business. They go out and they do their advertising, and they work really hard, and they get their technology right and all that sort of carry on. But without changing their business, they're able to increase their rate of profit quite significantly simply by this magical thing called debt leverage. Okay. Why doesn't everyone do it? In the property situation, let's look at what happens. I've put in 60% debt and I've increased my profit rate. What do you think would be the obvious thing for me to do? I've just discovered that going from no debt to 60% debt increases my profitability by 50%. What's the next obvious thing that I'm going to do? Isn't it that I'm going to maybe borrow some more? The more you borrow, the more you make. Okay, in this particular situation, still with an asset worth $120,000, I've now gone up to 80% debt leverage, and my return on equity is now 12.37%. That's more than twice what it was when we started, about 2.5 times as much as when we first started. Isn't that attractive? If I can do it with 80, why don't I go to 90? Again, it really is this incentive. And certainly in the property world, the nature of property as an investment asset is such that the thing itself, the asset itself, real estate, tends to be naturally low risk. And for reasons that I'll let you think about in your own time, it has induced everyone in the game to be more open to the use of debt because of the fundamentally low risk aspect of the underlying asset. If we were dealing with some underlying asset which was a bit more risky, probably the extreme would be gold prospecting, the likelihood of being able to access debt would be a lot less because the banks would be less inclined to lend to it. But with real estate, when I was kind of the age of most of you guys, maybe just, around sort of young 20s, early 20s, if you went to the bank, you tended to go to the bank expecting to only be able to get about 60% of the value of the real estate that you're thinking of buying. You're thinking about buying your first house, you'd go along and you'd have to have something like about 40% of the value of the house available as savings. It meant that people were a bit more cautious about buying houses. But over time, now you guys, and some of you have probably had this experience, if, again, you're in your early 20s and you're thinking about buying a house, you've got a sort of nice job and, you think you're starting a family, whatever you're going to be doing, you'll go along, and it's not uncommon to be going along to the bank, and they'll be offering to lend you 80%, maybe 90%, maybe even more with what's called mortgage insurance. And so over this period between when I was in my 20s, when you are, something has happened. Our community as a whole has become far more open to the reliance on debt in order to do the things that it does, partly because of this process that we've learnt the magic of debt funding. Okay, there's a bit more to it though, but fundamentally this is the attraction. It's an attraction to individuals buying their house for their home, for their family. It's also an attraction to businesses. And this is largely the question that we've got today. The question today is all about what amount of debt is it prudent for companies to carry in order to carry on their businesses. Let's scratch a little bit deeper. It looks like if I can get this number really high, I can earn fabulous amounts of money. Okay. The banks usually sort of lose interest when you get to very high numbers, so I'll just take that back to something a bit modest, about 60%. Now what I'm going to do is look at that all collected onto a single table. On this table, what I'm looking at is really two things. So far, we've been looking at what happens when the leverage ratio changes. And we've been working on an interest rate of 6%, and we're looking at what happens to the rate of return as the leverage amount changes, even though the interest rate remains constant. And so if I go along with $120,000, invest it in some asset, I don't borrow anything, I'll get this measly, conservative, stodgy 5.8%. If I'm a bit more aggressive and borrow a bit of money, I'll be able to increase that to 6.2, 6.9, 8.3, right up to 37%. Okay? And that's really what we're describing. However, I said that the story doesn't end there. And the reason is we've got the issue, the dimension of risk. While I can choose when I go to make my investment what level of leverage I use, I can go along and maybe let's say I've got $120,000 saved up. I've been working for a couple of years, living very frugally, maybe at my parents' place, not going out, spending a lot of money, got $120,000 in my pocket. I might be able to go to, you know, one of the towns in regional Australia and buy a house for $120,000. Not hard to do. And I might put tenants in it, and that's my investment. Okay? Or I might choose to go along to the bank and say, how much will you lend to me? I want to buy an investment property and I want to buy it, you know, on the waterfront of Melbourne, Sydney, Fremantle or somewhere. And I might be looking at a property not worth $120,000, but worth $1.2 million, where I'll be supplying basically 10% of the cost of the asset and the bank will be supplying 90%. Or I might go really sort of, you know, out of my tree and buy a property worth $2.4 million. Nice waterfront place, get really good tenants, managerial class, fantastic, where I'll only be putting in 5% of my asset cost, borrowing 95%, and I'll be getting a really fancy return. So I get to choose this. When I make my investment, I get to choose, in a sense, what leverage position I put myself into. Most people, when they set themselves up into investment, basically lock themselves into a leverage situation. If I've got 120,000, I will tend to buy as much as I can for the leverage I choose. If I decide to increase my leverage later on, yes, maybe I'll be able to do that. But usually it's very hard to reduce the leverage. That should be fairly obvious if you think about it. If I bought the $1.2 million worth of property, I've got my 120, so I've borrowed 90%. How do I go about reducing my leverage down to 80%? Well, I just put in another 120,000, don't I? Where do I get the $120,000 from? I don't have it. So I really don't have any control. Once I've bought the property, locked myself in, the practical side of it is that I'm sort of stuck with that leverage. It's very hard to adjust that. Fortunately, companies are able to do something different. If they find themselves over-geared, over-leveraged, they can sell more shares. Whereas an individual investor, that's a lot more difficult. I've got to work or rob a bank or something to go and get that extra cash. Okay. So the point here is that the leverage is a variable that has a wide range of possibilities, but by and large, once I make my choice, I'm stuck with it. Humphrey Bogart once famously said in a movie called Casablanca, you just pay your money and you make your choices. And that's pretty much what happens when you choose your leverage. Okay. Once you've made that choice, let's say we sit on 60%, who knows what the interest rate's going to be? In this example, we're working on about a 6% loan. Right now, if you're borrowing money to buy a house, you'll be able to buy a house on less than 6%. And the reason is that right now interest rates are rather low. So you might be able to get it at least a couple of percentage points lower than that. If you're looking at commercial borrowing, it might be higher still. But the other thing about it is it's not just a matter of the type of loan you get which sets the interest rate. Interest rates tend to change all the time. Right now, with all the uncertainty in the market and the difficulties we're having with the corona craziness and all the rest of it, interest rates are at an all-time low. There's a lot of uncertainty in the market. We're not sure whether Australia is going into a long-term recession or not. Certainly we're going into a recession because economic growth now is just plummeting. But will it be still here in 12 months' time, 2 years' time, 5 years' time? We don't know. And as a result of that, business confidence and all the rest of it, you know the economics, interest rates are low. However, interest rates could change almost overnight. Certainly month by month they can change. The Reserve Bank can set the cash rate tomorrow or next week or next month. And the interest rate might go, let's say from this notional 6%, might go down to 5%, or might go up to 7%. What's that going to do with my investment? Okay, I'm sitting here on my 60% leverage. If the interest rate currently is 8.3, if it falls to 5, I'm in the money because I'm able to get a 9% return now. previously I was only going to get an 8% return. If, however, the interest rates go up, all of a sudden my rate of profit, my yield, has actually fallen. The asset hasn't changed, the business hasn't changed, but my rate of profit has changed. If it goes up by a couple of percent, then who knows where I might end up with. I'm old enough to remember. A lot of you will probably have to talk to your parents to get living kind of contact with this. But I can remember a time when home mortgages the existing home mortgages were fixed by the government at 13.5%, because people going along to buy new homes, like new mortgages, new purchases, were paying anything 15, 16, 17, even 18% per annum on a regular mortgage. Crazy times towards the end of the 1980s. Hopefully they won't come again. So when we stop the clock down here at 10%, don't think that the possibilities don't extend way past that. And who knows what the upside is. We can see from the trend that the trend is downwards. And so if I do have my 60% leverage, depending on where the interest rates go, my rate of return now is going to be heavily influenced by the finance markets, completely independent of what my business is doing. If I didn't have any borrowings at all, it wouldn't really matter a hoot. Whether the interest rates go up or down, doesn't matter. I get my 5%, 5.8%, 5.8% forever, okay? But if I lock myself into one of these high leverage amounts, sure enough, in the good times, I'm getting my fancy 12 or more %. But if the interest rates go up or down a percentage point, you can see what a cruel thing it's able to do to the performance of my investment. And especially when we get out to this lofty level of 95%, down here, if the interest rates get back to what they have been within the last 20 years, you're actually going out backwards. Okay. Point here is that the more leverage you take, the more risk you take, because the variability of your rate of return is going to get progressively higher. Okay. What we're really doing here, putting it in terms of the framework that we learned when we looked at the capital asset pricing model, is that low debt equals low risk, and sure enough, it gives you a low rate of return. High debt, on the other hand, increases your risk, and therefore one expects a high required rate of return. And the CAPM model, capital asset pricing model, would say that there is this more or less linear relationship. As risk increases, your expected rate of return increases. And debt is a fantastic way of increasing your risk. In the domestic situation, people relying on more debt to buy their houses, and as I say, in 1970, people would have a deposit of somewhere around almost half of the value of the real estate they're thinking of buying when they're buying their house. Today, it orbits somewhere between 80 and 95%. And so today, people, when they buy their home, not intending it as an investment so much, are actually putting themselves in a far riskier position. It's one of the reasons why a lot more households go bankrupt than ever before in history. These are not businesses, involved in high-flying, high-risk business ventures. These are just households, maybe with a teacher and a policeman or something, living in them, going bankrupt. And the reason is they borrowed too much, interest rates have moved against them, and often something might happen in their family, and one of their children might get ill, one of them might have to stop work to spend a bit more time at the hospital or something. The next thing, they're going from 2 incomes to 1 income, just ordinary good people doing what sensible people have been telling them to do. And suddenly that household, that family, that married couple are facing bankruptcy. Happens far more often than we like to talk about. And it's a very common source of difficulties for marriages. We've got a big problem with divorce in Australia. One of the things that we haven't talked about in public is the way that financial ruin is an extraordinary strain on the marital relation. That ruins families, ruins children, causes all sorts of problems. And the root cause of it is overuse of debt. Okay, so leverage here. What I want to do is get you really sort of thinking about the power, the seductive attractiveness of debt, but also the risks. And these are risks that apply both corporately for companies, but also personally for individuals, right across the community. Okay, I think we might take a break now. I'll let you take 10 minutes. Often I run the breaks a little bit sort of over the hour. I think it'd be a good time to sort of stop at this point. We'll take a break, 10 minutes, then I'll come back and we'll just kind of whiz through the key learning here. We're going to be learning about two theories or two propositions that are very influential in the financial world, management finance, and how they use or how they revolve around this question of leverage. So that's what we've got in store, but we'll take a break now. I'll see you in 10 minutes. Okay.
Sir, are you muted?
Thank you very, very much. Yep, I appreciate that. I'm just talking to myself here and my dogs. I think the recording is going, so that's pretty important. Yep. Okay, let's carry on. Okay, what we're looking at is the choices that a company makes in terms of what's called its capital structure, which is really a fancy name for its debt leverage. There's a little bit more to capital structure for a company because its equity, its shares, can be held in a number of different forms. We've already looked at the difference between preference shares and ordinary shares, and we've also talked about the way that there are other types of shares, deferred shares and non-participating shares, all sorts of different shares, and you'll find those in the textbook. You can understand all of those very easily once you understand ordinary shares and preference shares. So it can be complicated, but the real question is how much debt? There's a little bit of a question about control of the company, which has got to do with use of preference shares or what have you. It's not really the topic of what we're talking about today. From what I was talking about earlier on, talking about leverage, it would appear that the more debt you use, the more valuable the company, because the greater the yield, and therefore the greater attractiveness to people wanting to buy those shares, because if I could buy one share that has a 5% return and another share that has got an 8% return, well, you know, I'd be a fool if I didn't buy the 8% return shares. One of the curious things about that is that if all else was equal, if I did find a situation like that, I would go and buy those 8% shares. A lot of other people would. Eventually the value, the price of those shares would go up because lots of people would be flocking to buy them. And oddly enough, the fact that people were flocking to buy them, their share price would go up. And because they're paying a particular amount of dividend and the share price is creeping up, what does that do to the yield? It would actually dampen the yield back from the 8% that I kind of came in for, back to somewhere around probably the 5%. And that's what happens. And that's exactly what happens in a well-functioning market. And the stock exchange is a good example of a well-functioning market in most cases. But here we're talking about something else. Some magic that a company can do that increases their yields. And the question is, does that make the company more valuable? Now, these two finance theorists, Modigliani and Miller, M and M. And around, it's getting to be a while back now, probably 30 years ago, something like that. I'll just find their names. They're in the notes here. Modigliani and Miller. Whereas when I first studied finance, we were looking at the way that using leverage was believed to change the value of a company. Modigliani and Miller said, no, we don't think so. And they said that if there aren't any taxes, there aren't any information on transaction costs, the investment policy of the company is not affected by its capital structure. More debt, less debt, doesn't make any difference. So that's Modigliani and Miller's first proposition. We'd like to consider the different possibilities for the amount of debt that a company carries. They could have all equity. You've got to have some equity in a company, otherwise it's not a company. I don't know what it is. But you've got to have some equity. And so you've got to have an all equity situation. You could start to introduce debt in, say, the lever example that I showed you at the very start. Or we get to the point where the debt grows, that grows, that grows. And so we've got most of our capital, as to the funds that the company uses to buy stuff with, is supplied by debt. That is the spectrum of possibilities. And what Modigliani and Miller proposed was that financial structuring doesn't affect the company value. And so ultimately you're going to end up with about the same value regardless of what that is. That sounds a bit radical because it works exactly the opposite to what I was pointing out with the magic of the effect of leverage. However, if you recall what we finished with when we were doing that almost like a mathematical exploration into the effects of leverage, I brought us back to the CAP-M model. And I said that low debt, low risk, and low return is both a consequence, but also an expectation. And that's evident when we increase our debt level, because not only does increased debt means that we have higher rate of return, because it's associated with a higher risk, the higher rate of return is expected. It's not simply a bonus, not because the company is cleverer. It's something which has to be there to justify the fact that we've introduced this extra risk, because somehow we've now got this extra level of risk. And so as a result, the value of the shares actually goes back down again. Even though there's more dividend being paid for every dollar of ordinary shares, the expectation is that you must be getting a higher return to cope with the extra risk. That's the M&M proposition number one. Okay, if we go through the notes, you'll find there's some nice mathematical demonstrations here, and I recommend you read through those. And they're good to work through to help you reinforce your understanding of the costs of capital, costs of debt, costs of the various components and so on, and the weighted average cost of capital concept. So read through those and work through them in your own time. Maths is pretty simple, but it does illustrate what's kind of going on. Okay, and I say just read through these notes and work through the slides. I think you'll find them. They should be very straightforward. You might have to read them a couple of times to absolutely make sense, but it's not groundbreaking. It's basically reinforcing why the M&M proposition number one works. One of the things that you will notice is that when you go from low debt to high debt, there is a change in the cost of equity. The rate of return expected from your ordinary shares. That's the trick, which is kind of hiding in here. And as long as you see that, the maths is quite straightforward. Okay, and there's a couple of examples here. And there's two examples, two maths, if you like, to make it easier for you to totally see it really obviously. You don't need both of them. If that makes sense first time you read it, don't worry about grinding through the second one. But if it's still a bit clunky, it doesn't quite make sense, just do the second example, work through the second example on a piece of paper with your financial calculator next to you, or your regular calculator, so that it really, you know, it's like riding the bicycle, right? It's sort of, it becomes really obvious and almost second nature. Okay. Now we get to a second proposition, the M&M proposition number 2. Kind of relates to the first one. Really, it's just like the flip side of it. And that is that the cost of a company's ordinary shares, in other words, their rate of return, their expected rate of return, is directly related to the debt to equity ratio. This is, if you like, formalizing the relationship into a nice, tight mathematical relationship. It's a proposition. It's not necessarily something which is somehow written into the very fabric of the universe, like the, you know, Newton's gravity equation. But it is something that, if you assume the things which Modigliani and Miller assume, and you assume a perfect market, so it was a very free-flowing financial market, then something like this kind of pops out. Whether you see it realised in the physical universe or not, in the Australian Stock Exchange or wherever, that's sort of another question, because real stock exchanges tend to not be quite as perfect as the representations you find in textbooks. There's one little wrinkle here that I'd just like to point out to you. Only a very tiny thing, it's just a little typo. If you look at this equation, you'll notice that in here we've got K of common shares. And the cost of common shares equals the cost of assets plus the ratio of the values of debt versus ordinary shares, all multiplied by the cost of assets minus cost of debt, right? That's a fine equation. We'll find that in the textbook. What you won't actually, won't find this quite in the textbook. The reason is the subscript here, OS, should be the same subscript as over here where they've got CS. And it's because whoever wrote this equation was thinking, yeah, common shares are equal to ordinary shares, da-di-da, and so there's a typo. I haven't been able to fix that typo just simply because of the way that the PowerPoints are written. But as long as you realise that CS equals OS anyway, common shares, synonym for ordinary shares, you know, you're on the money, won't be a problem. As we go through, as you read through the notes, you'll see down here in this slide, you've got the same equation written up. Okay, same equation. But here you've got cost of ordinary shares, so the CS has been turned into OS. You've still got VOS over the other side, the value of the ordinary shares, and so on. It's the same equation, written out just a little bit differently, but the typo is removed, so it's not as though it's something which was really intended. So I just thought I'd mention that because somebody might sort of send me an email and say, oh, I don't know if that equation is really right in the PowerPoints. I thought, well, I better mention it. The important thing, though, is that M&M proposition number 2 is that the cost of shares, the required rate of return, is linearly related through this ratio to the ratio of debt to ordinary shares. Okay, it's a nice proposition, tends to work most of the time, but it also is very much dependent on its assumptions. The assumptions were all about the absence of taxation, which is a big one, and also the absence of transaction costs. Now, neither of those things hold in the real world. So M&M propositions numbers 1 and 2 actually don't hold in the real world. However, we can approach it, and we need to be aware that that's kind of what's lurking in the background if we had a perfect market and we didn't have transaction costs or taxation. As you go through the notes, as I say, just read through them, work through the maths. And I think everything which is in the words I've more or less covered, especially when we're talking about the leverage stuff, and the rest of it just follows very much from the way that businesses are defined, especially public listed companies. I want you to look at this slide. This is a terrific slide. I find these representations of the way that corporations work very useful because they provide a very powerful symbolic relationship of what's really going on. You might remember a couple of weeks or a few weeks ago now, I showed you a similar one, which was a breakup of the profit and loss statement. Here we're doing the same thing. But here we're emphasizing a slightly different aspect, and that is that this top part of the profit and loss statement before the EBIT, revenue, sales, inflow, cash flow, less your cost of sales, this is your gross profit. That's your business. If your business is working hard, baking bread, brewing beer, carting things across the continent on semi-trailers, whatever your business is, this is how hard your business is actually working, and this is your variable costs of actually getting your sales to happen. Okay, that's your business. Then you'll also have your general, what we call fixed costs. And really these two top sections here are your business. And it's only when you get down to operating profit, what another day I'd call the EBIT, that's the threshold between the business side of your doings and the financial side. Because the financial side is when you start to think about debt leverage and managing your taxation. Okay, there is a risk associated with running your business. Maybe you're baking bread and you find that not too many people want to eat bread. You might find everyone becomes gluten intolerant, and so you lose some sales, and that's no good. That's a business risk. You might find that your suppliers run dry, or maybe there's some environmental legislation change which makes it more expensive to run your factory, or maybe to get your raw materials, or get rid of your rubbish, whatever it is. They're all business risks. Here, the point being made is this right-hand side of this diagram. It's a really useful diagram because it shows the way that there is a distinction between the business risk and the financial risk. The financial risk has a lot to do with this thing here, your interest expense. Without debt leverage, you don't have a financial risk, or at least the financial risks you have are relatively small. Okay, they've got to do with things, maybe legislation changes, changes in taxation policy, whatever. But the real big one is availability of debt funds and the cost of debt funds. That's your finance risk. And once you borrow money, you're exposed to the financial risk. What this means is that your whole business has risks that are related to both the business risk compounding into your finance risk. To a certain extent, when the economy as a whole is going up, so your business is booming and profits are going through the roof, that's fantastic. That's about the time when the RBA says, well, we need time to cool down the place. We're going to put interest rates up. And so your finance costs, the risk of the financial world moving against you, is actually aggravated by your own success, or at least the country's success. Conversely, now that business risk is really high because just how many businesses are going bust at the moment as a result of the corona craziness or whatever. So business risks are very high. So the Reserve Bank responds by reducing interest rates, hopefully making finance a bit more attractive, and so trying to keep businesses from closing up their doors or what have you. And so there's this kind of interplay between the business risk and the finance risk. one way or another, if you don't borrow money, you're far less susceptible to finance risk, and therefore your total business risk, your equity risk, your investment risk is a lot lower. So it's a good graphic, good concept to give thought to. Okay, there are a couple of other assumptions which are built into this whole leverage question. When we looked at the leverage question in that Excel spreadsheet that I showed you right at the very, very beginning, we were assuming that you could change your leverage without having really any significant impact on your relationship with the bank, with your creditor. And that's pretty much what's assumed here. This diagram assumes that regardless of what your leverage is, and debt equity ratio is a measure of leverage, the cost of debt is constant. The cost of assets, or the rate of return of your assets, is constant. And because of the magic of leverage, you've got an increase in the performance of your shares, but also their cost, the expectations of the market, because of the increase in risk. That's a different way of demonstrating M&M proposition number 1 and 2 for that matter. Probably especially proposition number 2, because what it's saying is that this slopey blue line here is basically compensating in a linear way for the fact that you've got the leverage advantage as a result of the higher leverage degree. However, the real world's a bit more complicated. Not only do we have taxes and transaction costs to take account of, we also have the fact that if you go to the bank to borrow more money, proportionate to the value of the asset, the bank progressively becomes less and less comfortable with lending to you. And they usually reflect that in the interest rate that they charge. In commercial lending, it's referred to as the premium, which is put on the commercial loan as a result of the particular circumstances of the venture. You can see that here in the way that the green line just gently kicks up towards the end. But the other thing, and it's not totally obvious with this diagram because it's sort of spread out over a very wide area, is that this line here is slowly growing. Even down here, it's slowly growing. There's a slight premium, a slight edge, a margin, an extra, which is added to the interest rate. Here, slightly misnamed expected return, but a slight margin which is being added here as the leverage increases. But that margin itself accelerates once the debt ratios get to be fairly significant. So that's why there's got a bit of a, like a little bit of a hockey kind of curl at the very end. What that means is that because of this growing cost of debt, the change in the cost of ordinary shares isn't a straight line necessarily. It tends to be a bit bowed. And you can see here, it's got a slight hump in it. You can sort of see it in the diagram, I think. Probably better if you can sort of compress this thing up. I don't know if I can do that on here. I'll just try that. No. Here we go. I'll compress that right up, and that should make it more obvious that we're dealing with curves. Cost of asset remains flat, but here you can see it's got a very much a curve in it, whereas the previous diagram that we were looking at was flat, and likewise this one's got a curve going the other way. I'll put that back roughly where it started off with to show you what's kind of going on there. Okay. Pretty much a restatement of the assumptions. I want to come down to this diagram and look at the circumstances. We had a diagram very similar to this right at the very, like the beginning of these slides, where we looked at capital structure. Here we're putting in the reality of tax. Tax is you know, that share of the profits goes to the government for very fine and laudable purposes. But as we increase our debt, odd things happen with the amount of taxation. Here we've got taxation, looks like it's about 25%, maybe 30% of the whole pie. The available profits before, or earnings before profits, earnings before interest. Here, when we add debt, it actually reduces the amount of tax we pay. And the reason is that at present in Australia, probably will be for some time to come, probably all of your working lives, the cost of debt is a tax deduction. I don't know if there is some fundamental reason, some law of nature why interest costs should be tax deductible. It's just that they have been for some time, and they're probably going to be for some time. People expect it, banks like it, companies utilise the opportunities it provides, so it's probably not going to change. It just happens to be the way it is. The more debt you use, the less tax you pay. And that becomes an incentive to use more and more debt. And so the tax aspect itself becomes part of the strategic thinking that a company will work through, especially its managers, when considering what level of debt leverage to use in the company. And there becomes this greater incentive to move over to this kind of a capital structure. Okay, you can read through these slides, and I'd like you to do that. The concept is very much a review. The important thing is to look in terms of the cost of debt. Let's say the 6% we were talking about before. If we're paying tax, let's say we're paying tax at the rate of 33%. It's actually 30%, but let's imagine it was a 33% loss, easy third. What that means is that we pay 6% to the bank, but we get to deduct that interest cost from our taxation obligations. And so we get a deduction equal to a third of the 6%. What's a third of 6%? 2%. And so it means that while we're paying the bank 6%, it actually only hurts us 4%. And so companies have a strong incentive to borrow money because it's so cheap after tax. The Australian government, in a sense, is subsidising our love affair with being indebted. They don't do that to individuals when they buy their houses, but certainly anyone who's running a business has that lovely tax advantage. And that's encapsulated in this equation here. The real cost of debt is D times T. It's the cost of debt times the tax rate. The benefit from using debt. It's referred to in the textbook and by a lot of commentators as a tax shield. Tax shield is like a protection, and it is a form of protection from having to pay tax. And both privately and in corporations, the financial function is partly managed to reduce preferably your legal, licit obligations to pay tax, to minimise your tax. And by using debt, you're actually minimising your legal obligations to pay tax. So it becomes what's called, in some cases, a tax shield. And you'll find that in the notes here and also in the textbook, there's lots of references to the words tax shield. It always refers to the way that the tax deductibility of debt gives you an insensitivity to the tax rate. Okay, come down here to 45. There's a lovely diagram. Let's look at this one. And that quantifies, at least schematically, the value of what they're calling the tax shield, the interest tax shield. The more debt the company is carrying, the better the company is shielded from its taxation obligations, or the obligations that it have if it was entirely equity funded. You've got to be a little bit cautious with this, though. In a sense, paying tax is not a bad thing. I often tell people I would love to have to pay $1 million tax every year. Love to. A lot of people try and run away from it. But if I was paying $1 million tax every year, it probably means that my income before tax must be probably $2 or $3 million a year. And I wouldn't mind that at all. So paying tax is not a bad thing. Some people might be earning $1 million a year, and they prefer, rather than paying $350,000 to maybe only paying $100,000 or maybe none at all. And that's where the tax issue becomes a bit complicated, and the people that abuse it are a bit naughty. You're probably aware of the implications of that. Two differences we're talking about here. Talking about the difference between tax avoidance and tax minimization. Here, what we can see is that by using debt, we are able to minimize our tax obligations, and that produces what's being referred to as an interest tax shield. That's totally different to avoiding tax, which is doing some dodgy thing to avoid our legal obligations, which is definitely not recommended unless you want to end up in prison. Okay. So from all of this, we've got the benefit of using tax, which gives us this tax shield. Sorry, the benefit of using debt, which gives us a tax shield. We've got a number of other benefits as well. It turns out that using debt has a lot of almost unexpected benefits. I'll let you read through these in detail yourself, either on the PowerPoint slides where they're kind of laid out in bullet points. You'll also find them delightfully laid out in the textbook. And for those of you who want to really fully understand the unit, reading the textbook is really the way to go. And as you read it, by the way, it's your textbook. And what they would have told you at school, or what your mother told you when you were in kindergarten or what have you, never take a pen to a book. By all means, as you're reading your textbook, go through it. Underline or highlight the parts that really stand out to you as important. It helps you to remember them. Also, consider writing little notes to yourself, or maybe even commentaries or criticisms in the margin. Putting those little margin notes in is really useful. Right now, 2020, you're studying business finance at university. If you pull that textbook down from the shelf in 5 years' time or 10 years' time or what have you, when some of this stuff might become very relevant in your business life, it'll be very handy if you can go to page, what it is, 346 or something in the textbook, and find, the important part is highlighted there. Or there's a little comment on the side where you've made some little note about something which you thought was important or maybe a bit peculiar or what have you. And so when you're reading a textbook, especially if you've got a paper textbook, put those comments in. You can kind of do that in the PDF world as well, but it's not quite as comfortable. But I'll leave that up to you. Okay, read through these, the other benefits. And you'll notice that as you read through these benefits, you'll find some of them are, at first sight, quite weird. One of the ones which I find really unusual is that if you use debt, it tends to incline your managers to be more honest. And you think, whoa, what's that got to do with, maximising returns and all that sort of carry on? Well, it doesn't have very much at all. However, it does have a lot to do with your business running well, your company working well. And read through the mechanics of how that works out as we go along. We'll talk about it a little bit more as we speak further. Down here. Debt can be used to limit the ability of bad managers to waste shareholders' money. Isn't that delightful? Okay. And it's worth kind of taking on board because it's a real issue. Okay, read through the rest of these. As I say, it reads more like a novel, but it's a good idea for you to interact with these things and, give them some thought, see the sense in them, and that way you'll remember them for a long time to come. And they'll be very useful things for you to know as time goes on. Okay, Now we move to this diagram, which I think is probably the most representative of what's going on. We've already talked about the way that interest rates will go up as your leverage goes up. Here we put a lot of this stuff together. And one of the things that we observe in conclusion is that the benefit of using debt, when we take into account things like your transaction costs and your taxation situation and just the foibles of human nature, a little bit of debt helps the value of the company. A bit more debt will tend to help it a bit more. But you end up with what an economist would refer to as a situation of diminishing marginal utility. And for those of you who remember your economics, you know that diminishing marginal utility is when as something, you get more of something, the benefit from having that little bit extra more gets less and less until it gets to the point where a bit more actually is inconvenient. Okay. In economics, it might have been explained to you in terms of how much ice cream can you eat in a night. You know, a little bit of ice cream is absolutely fabulous. A little bit more ice cream is even more fabulous. But if someone was to sit you down and force feed you, 3 litres of ice cream after dinner on a Sunday night, you'd probably end up very uncomfortable and sick and who knows what. So the utility, the marginal utility of a bit of extra ice cream, every extra spoonful that you have, while it increases the utility, the enjoyment of having it, they progressively become less and less until you get to the point where an extra spoonful of ice cream becomes absolutely repugnant. Okay, we've got the same sort of thing working on here. What we're saying is that past this sweet spot, this ideal level of debt, capital structure, if you want to use the formal term, once you get past that, the benefits of the company actually start to roll off to the point where you carry too much debt and you end up with the problems of using debt exceeding the benefits. And now we start to look at some of the costs. And I'll let you read through those. Things like, if you're carrying a lot of debt, you've got a lot of risk. If you've got a lot of risk, then one way or another, a word gets out, then you may find it difficult dealing with your customers, dealing with your suppliers, dealing with your employees. And if it gets to the point where you have trouble servicing your debt, which is a fancy expression for paying your interest bills, and word gets out, you might find that people suddenly become very coy about lending to you. They'll charge you extra interest costs as a kind of insurance policy on their side. Tends to make it doubly difficult for you to be able to do it. I mean, you're having trouble paying an normal interest rate, and then all of a sudden your bank sort of turns around and says, oh, you're actually a bad risk. We're going to, add an extra couple of % to your interest cost. So it's going to make it totally difficult. A lot of companies are sunk simply because their reputation sort of goes down. And when we talk about insolvency, insolvency is a situation where the business, for whatever reason, is not able to meet its debt obligations, usually in terms of paying down the interest or paying off the interest and paying down the principal. Insolvency is often the first stage towards a company collapsing. And it's because insolvency, the situation where your income doesn't meet your debt obligations and your other obligations for that matter, usually causes a lot of other dominoes to start falling, which includes things like losing your employees, having more problematic relations with your suppliers, and even having more suspicious customers. So you read through those in your own time. Okay, well, I'll let you read through those. I've talked about most of them. I'll talk about the lows, talk about those. Now we get to this interesting area. And this is the whole notion of agency issues. We talk about agency issues in our consideration of companies because there's a thing called the agency problem. The agency problem it works like this. If I get somebody else to do something for me that maybe in another world, another situation, I might have been able to do myself. I might get someone to mow my lawn for me. I'm living pretty comfortably as an academic, so I couldn't be bothered mowing my own lawn. I get somebody, Jim's mowing or something, to come in and do it for me. Fantastic. Okay. My objective is to have a nice lawn and perhaps not have to worry too much about the labour involved in doing it, whatever. But my objective is primarily to have a good lawn without the inconvenience. That's my objectives. When I use the agent, let's say Jim's Mowing have different objectives. The Jim's Mowing man who comes along, his objective is to earn a living, put, beans on the table for his family and run a good business. And he knows that to do that, he has to mow my lawn. But to a certain extent, he can put more beans on the table if he's able to mow more lawns in the day, which means he might sort of cut a couple of corners here and there. Maybe not attend to it quite as diligently as I would myself, whatever. And the reason is that he's worked out that his objectives will be met if he doesn't do a first-class quality job, or at least not the first-class quality job that I'll know about. And if he works out that I'm not very, maybe my eyesight's a little bit poor when I take my reading glasses off, and he knows that he can, leave the bindy eyes kind of going wild or what have you, then I won't notice. His objectives are different to mine. And this is a problem we have in any agency situation. In a corporation, the employees in the company are agents of the owners. The owners are the shareholders. The owners aren't necessarily anybody who rolls their sleeves up and gets involved in the business. The objective of the owners of the company, the shareholders, is to maximize their wealth. The object of the employees of the company is to have a secure salary and maybe a maximized secure salary. So their objectives are totally different. Both of them might see that, producing the product that the company is there to produce, brewing beer or baking bread. But in amongst the central object of the company, to bake bread, are these other secondary objectives: maximizing the shareholders' wealth for the shareholders, maximizing the salary and, working situation and job security, whatever, for the employees. And so the agents, who are the employees, have a different objective, partly, to the shareholders. And that's what we're talking about here with agency costs. When we're talking from the financial perspective, we've got an extra layer here, because it's not simply all of the employees of the company who are the agents. We've got different agents in different parts of the company. We might have the mail boy or the cleaner. They'll have different objectives to the senior management. And the senior management might have different objectives to the middle management. The middle management has got different objectives to the actual workers or to the senior management. And the workers are there with a different set of objectives altogether. And all of them are a bit different to the shareholders. Now, in this section, we're looking particularly at the agency costs, primarily between the shareholders and the managers. We observed in one of the earlier slides that one of the odd advantages of debt leverage is that it tended to put an incentive on managers to be prudent. And so to a certain extent, it pushes the managers to be a little bit more cautious, a bit more prudent in their overall behaviour. And so that helps the shareholders, because the shareholders don't have to look over their shoulder quite so much. On the flip side, by using debt, the managers are able to produce an apparent improvement in the performance of the company. The yields improve. That's what we saw when we looked at the leverage. And so the agents as managers are seeing advantages in terms of being able to please the shareholders because the yields apparently are higher. The shareholders are looking at more debt, saying, well, but the fixed obligations that come with debt can have the effect of keeping the managers honest. This is sort of tussle. Okay, the agency issues, the agency problem, fabulously interesting, and I really invite you to read through there and just see if you can, get a feel. Imagine yourself in the environment of a company and just imagine how these agency issues, these different agency costs work. Curious thing is that there are, as I say, there are different relationships being involved. You've got the shareholder manager agency issue, you've got the shareholder worker issue, you've got the manager worker issue, which is also an agency problem. One of the curious ones that we meet in this, if I can find it, read through these, is the shareholder lender agency problem. This is a really tricky one. It works like this. The bank wants to make money out of the loan. It wants its debtors, the company in this case, to pay all of the interest and all of the principal on the loans that it pays. That's its objective. The shareholders, on the other hand, they like to use credit primarily as a way of lowering their capital costs. And so their objectives are different. And there are occasions when the lender can look at the shareholder as their agent for making money. Okay? I might be the bank, I might lend to you. I'm looking at you up and down thinking, is lending to Pete, Sue, Bill, Alice a good idea? Is it a good way of me getting my interest income? And I'm leaving it to you to actually run the business to do it. You're the shareholder. You're going to be exercising whatever control you have over the company. And while you honour your obligations to me, your obligations, your objectives are a little bit different. So it's a curious twist on the agency problem. And I do invite you to give it some thought. Okay, I can introduce it, but read the textbook, think over these slides, and just imagine the logic of it, if you like. Okay, that's just more on this issue. I want to get down to the more practical question now. We've considered the costs of debt, we've considered the advantages of debt, we've considered the risks, we've considered the agency problem. What I want to do now is look at the practical question of, well, okay, we've got all these advantages and disadvantages, and we've got these different people sort of, there's agency kind of issues between them. How do we actually solve the problem? If the company wants to expand, if it wants to pay for some new project or buy some new asset or something, how does it decide whether to use debt or equity? That's a practical problem. It is the problem of how to design, how to plan your capital structure. So when we talk about capital structure decisions, what we're really doing is talking about decisions relating to the question of whether we fund our company or a particular project using debt or equity, okay? Or maybe different types of equity, maybe even different types of debt. There are two main theories that it's good to get your head around. Both of them are fairly easy. Okay, so I'll just go through them sort of briefly, read about them, think about them, what have you. And the two theories are the trade-off theory and the pecking order theory. The trade-off theory is very simply that the managers, who are really the people who are making the decisions in this regard on the ground, those managers will make capital structure decisions, whether to fund some expansion, say, by borrowing money from the bank or relying more on equity. They will make those decisions simply by weighing up, not mathematically, but strategically, politically, emotionally even, weighing up the advantages and the costs. And so if they think that the advantages of raising debt outweigh the costs of raising debt, then they'll use debt. If they think that the advantages of using equity are better, then they'll use equity. And so there's no cut and dried answer to it. It's more a matter of if every situation is personal, not so much personal, but particular to a particular corporate situation. And it's just a matter of being aware of those costs and benefits and then sort of juggling them, which means you really can't make a wrong decision in one sense. But on the other hand, if you go too far out on a limb, either too much equity or too much debt, then it still can be, it can be called to account. Because people will say, well, what was the reason? What were the trade-offs that you're making in going to the bank rather than selling more shares or relying on retained earnings? Okay, I think we've seen this diagram already. We don't need to see it again. The second theory is what's called the pecking order theory. It's actually very, very similar in many ways. What this would say is that if I'm a manager of some company and I need to expand, I need to, open some new factory or start some new product line or something, what I will do is I'll source funds in order of which ones are easier and cheaper. And at that point, you start to look very seriously at what the costs and the convenience of the different sources of funds are. For instance, I might have had a good year last year before coronavirus came along. And I might have a whole lot of profit which is sitting in the company, and I'm thinking about whether or not to pay it out to my shareholders as a dividend. And then I want to do some expansion. And I look at that bucket of money sitting there and I think, well, I was going to give my shareholders a bumper dividend this year. However, if I do the bumper dividend, write them all these checks, I'm going to have to turn around next week and sell some more shares to go and finance this new expansion, new product line, whatever. Isn't it easy if I just go along to the shareholders and say, oh, well, guess what? What we're going to do, we're not going to pay the dividend. We're just going to make the company more valuable. And what that means is that your shares now are going to go up in value. You won't get a check, but you will get a more valuable share. Has it cost me anything to get that extra capital? Not at all. Because in a sense, the money is there sitting there and kitty anyway. All I've done is just simply not given it away or given it out to my shareholders. Okay. So it's really cheap to organise. Does it hurt my shareholders? Well, if the shareholders know, let's imagine I've got $1 worth of shares, like my share price is $1, and I've got a 10 cents worth of dividend just waiting to be paid out. Okay? Before I pay that dividend out, and if the market knows about it, that share price will go up to about $1.10. And the reason is that if I buy the share today for $1.10, it's really only worth $1. But tomorrow I'm going to get a check in the mail for 10 cents, and the price is going to fall back down to $1. That's a fair price. So the share prices do tend to respond to expectation of dividends. However, if I buy the share, I'm willing to pay $1.10 for it, and then the company announces, oh, well, we've made all this profit, we're not going to distribute any dividend. The dividend has stayed in the company, the share price will remain at the $1.10. And so I haven't won, I haven't lost as a shareholder, I'm indifferent. If I really want some money out of those shares, I might sell some of them. So I might sell 10% of my parcel of shares at $1.10. And if I do that, I end up with the same amount of money in my pocket as I would have if I had received the dividend. So from the point of view of the shareholder, I'm indifferent to whether my shares go up in value or I get a separate check in the mail. From the company's point of view, they've got all of this extra capital then that they're able to spend. Okay, so that's cheaper. The second cheapest form of debt is using your creditors. We'll assume that your creditors are already being managed fairly efficiently, but I might go to the market and borrow money, especially through debentures. There's a certain transaction cost involved in doing that. I've got to arrange the debentures. I've got to work out what security is going to work on them. I'm going to have to produce a prospectus and so on, so that people know what they're getting when they buy a debenture from me. But it's a lot cheaper than a share offering, which can cost a lot more, both in the compliance costs, telling ASIC that I'm going to be selling shares, making the arrangements, basically marketing them, if you like. Selling shares or raising, for a company to sell shares is probably the most expensive way to raise capital. Raising debt is cheaper. Retaining earnings is virtually no cost at all. Preference shares tends to be kind of cheaper than selling ordinary shares. And so the pecking order theory would say that I obtain my extra capital by working things in a pecking order. I go from the cheapest and most beneficial to me right up to, progressively by exploiting those sources until eventually I might have to take some money out of the most expensive sources. Pecking order usually starts off with retained earnings, goes through debt, preference shares, and then eventually extra share sales. I'll let you read about that in the notes there. Okay, maths and the order of pecking order, that's sort of fun to read. There was a diagram that I was hoping to find in here. Okay, might have missed it somewhere along the way. The last two, yeah, just read through those, and I think we've just about covered the topic. As I say, interesting topic, more to do with concepts, and if you like, the social political issues, the power struggles that operate between the different players. Definitely worth reading the textbook if you can. And yeah, the maths is sort of secondary. Go through the maths, the examples that are on here. You'll find they're very similar to what you find in the textbook. That's a kind of maths which is not very, it's not challenging maths, but just the application, things like, say, the pecking order. Let's find an example of the pecking order. Here we go. Just read through that. It should be pretty obvious how it works. Basically, what we're saying is that we're going from cheapest internal funds is internal funds, in other words, undistributed profits, and then it goes through and just basically tells a story, and then the pecking order basically just realizes that story in terms of how the fundings work. Okay, I think that's about it for today. Thank you very, very much for your attention. As I say, if you're one of the very few people that don't have your assignment marked at the moment, they will be marked and back to, I think there's only a handful, maybe half a dozen still to go. And I will be saying a couple of other things about the assignment, especially in terms of a resubmit option for those of you who came in under the line. Okay, thank you for your attention. Have a good week, and I'll see you this time next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, all the best.